Welcome everybody to our AIB webinar featuring the latest research from the Academy's two journals, the Journal of International Business Studies and the Journal of International Business Policy. My name is Marleen Dieleman, and I'm an associate professor of strategy and family business at the National University of Singapore. And together with Klaus Meyer, who's at the Ivy Business School, we will be your co-hosts today. And these webinars provide a forum for sharing research insights and discussing its implications. And the webinar series has been started in May last year, and it keeps on running with many participants, as we can see. First of all, I'd like to thank the AIB for organizing this series, especially Dana Mimbeva, and also support from Tunga, Kiak, and the tech support from Digital Motions. What we do is in this series is we select 3 recently published papers in JIBS or JIBP that speak to one of the big questions in international business. And we then try to bring together both senior people and also younger scholars who might have published for the first time in these journals. So just a little bit of housekeeping rules. You can actively participate in this seminar by posting your questions, and that will be through the Q&A function in Zoom. So at the bottom of your screen, you should find a Q&A button. And you can write your questions there. You can actually write your questions during the whole seminar. We'll first have the 3 presentations, and after that we'll do Q&A, but it doesn't prevent you from already putting your questions in. You can also use a chat, but it will be more difficult for us to monitor, so kindly use the Q&A. You can also like the questions in the Q&A, which will make them move up in the list and bring them to our attention. Now, please do use this opportunity to engage, because we hope this will be an interactive seminar. Now, today's seminar will focus on family firms and internationalization. And we have 3 papers, all of them recently published in JIBS. And before I give the floor to the first speaker, I would like to set a broad context for the topic today. Well, let me talk a little bit about the family business field. So family business has been a growing scholarly field with its own journals as well, such as the Family Business Review, totally dedicated to it. While in its very early days, it was somewhat of a niche area associated with applied research. In recent years, the growing family business academic community has emerged as a mature scholarly field, and it also has its own theories. And gradually it attracted far more attention from mainstream journals such as SMJ, ASQ, AMR, and of course also JIBS. And one topic of interest, which is our topic today, is family business internationalization. As family business scholars suggest, that family firms have some essentialist characteristics that may lead them to internationalize differently as compared to non-family firms. And not only that, there are a lot of family firms among the world's population of firms, and they also come in different types. So amongst those types, there are also vast differences. Now, all these discoveries are really exciting because they can lead to new theorizing in the international business field. And that's exactly what these 3 papers have done. So we start today's webinar with Antonio.
Hi, Marleen, sorry for coming late. And apologies for the audience for the technical issues, which you can rest assured there were flying a lot of emails, and there will be a lot of follow-up because we've done this so many times. We've never had a late start. Rest assured, we will discuss afterwards to make sure it doesn't happen again. I just wanted to say a few words of welcome. Marleen has been kind enough to say the introductory words that I usually say at this point. I'm excited about this because I'm not a family business specialist, but I work with the general theory of the multinational enterprise. And for me, the big question is always, do we really need a special theory for the family firm? Is there really something different? Because in my world, which is very European, continental European, a lot of family firms are operating on the global stage, right? So it's not so surprising they are internationally active, even though that may be less common in Anglo-Saxon countries. So yeah, I think we really should to figure out, is there something special? And with that, let me hand over to our first speaker.
Okay, let me briefly introduce. So Antonio is a professor of global management at Luis University in Rome, Italy. He's also joining us from Rome, I think. And he has done very interesting work on the internationalization of small and medium-sized enterprises, and many of you will be familiar with his work. So how are family firms different in their internationalization practice, and what does it mean for international business theories? We are going to start this webinar with an excellent paper, which is full of little diamonds of ideas for future research, and it also answers these questions. So Antonio and his co-authors have done a systematic literature review where they present common internationalization themes familiar to all of us IB scholars, and they provide suggestions for future theory development. I'm very, very excited to have Antonio present this paper, and it's a very good paper to set the stage. So Antonio, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Can you see the slides? Yes. Okay. So I will have 10 minutes from now, and here I am. Thank you, Marleen. Thank you, Klaus, for your nice introduction. I can go quickly to the paper. Of course, in 10 minutes, I cannot present the paper. I just will focus on 3 main points. Are family firms relevant? That's the first point. The second point, as you will see, will be about how we organize our literature review. Do we need a literature review? And the third point will be about the future research avenue in family firms internationalization. Are family firms important? My answer is yes, and I put some number here. Family firms are 60% of the global workforce, 50% of world GDP. But there are, as Klaus underlined before, there are a number of companies which are family firms. And this is true both in the European, but also in the South Asian, South American, in many contexts. And let me say that this is true also in the Anglo-Saxon world, where maybe you don't have very large family firm, even if Walmart, for example, is a large family firm. So family firms are important. In some business, like in the niche market, global niche market, as a paper with Jean-François and Nag show, they are even the leaders in the field. And they have another characteristic, in my view, which they have longevity, and they tend to be very resilient in crisis time. And in this period, I think this is an important characteristic. Do we need a new family firm literature? That was a question that we asked ourselves at the beginning of the journey to prepare, because there has been a lot of family firm review before. Of course, our answer was yes, we need it. and we justify our effort because we say that most of the previous family firms review was just take the perspective of family firm scholars. And we think that when we are discussing about internationalization, we need to use the tools and the instruments of IB theory. So it's not enough, as most of the papers say, that family firms deviate from value maximizing and profit maximizing behavior. We also say that you need to include IB theory in the perspective. And we found in our review that just less than 20% of the study use a proper IB framework. So that was our starting point. I don't want to go through the paper into details. Let me just say that we selected 220 papers out of a number of almost 40 papers. We select what we consider the most focus on family firms internationalization. And we decided to organize the review along 7 main IB topics: international scope, international scale, entry modes, location choices, the process of internationalization, the velocity, the rapidity of internationalization, And finally, the effect of family firms centralization over performance. And we found this organization quite effective, and this will allowed us to identify some guidelines and some questions that are still unanswered. And I will try to focus my last few minutes on this. Before doing that, let me say that there are some points that now are, I think, shared among family firm scholars and international business scholars. The first is that family firms has some peculiar feature that impact on the level of internationalization, on the mode of internationalization in a new way. Luciano will talk about this, and Xu as well. But the second point that is agreed upon by most of the scholars is that to understand internationalization, you need, as Klaus reminds us, a good IB theory, and you don't need anything completely new. We already have a very good theory of internationalization, but there are many different, and this is the contribution of family first scholar, I think, there are many different kinds of family firms. And so the analysis of the different kinds of family firms and allow us to understand family firms internationalization, to differentiate internationalization. But there is one point which I call the family firm paradox, that show that sometimes most of the studies show that family leadership is not harmful to internationalization, but at the same time, professionalization and external manager, minority shareholding from foreign investor, all this professional approach to management helps family firms to have better results and show higher level of international involvement. So there are some points that are common points, but there are a number of issues that still remain unanswered. I didn't coordinate myself with Klaus, but I think that the main point today is the integration of IB theory into family firms internationalization. Family firms have some specific strength. Luciano will use the term firm-specific advantages, I guess, because this is the jargon that we use in IB. I agree. They have long-term orientation, social capital that Marleen knows very well, and so on and so forth. But they have also some weaknesses, nepotism, localism, and so on and so on. So I think that there is very large room for developer theory that can show how the strength of family firms can become firm-specific advantages, and how these firm-specific advantages can be mixed with assets which are located in other country, which FSA are bounded and which locationally bounded and which are not, and so on and so forth. So there are a large room for discussion. And so I don't go into the details because Luciano will discuss this, but there are many possibilities that family firms have to improve and to leverage on their strength. Again, we try to make the case of family firms which are specializing in global niche firm in a previous paper. This is my last slide. Which are the avenue for future research? There are many. In the paper, we organize the discussion about the potential level of analysis. There are 4 potential levels of analysis of family firms internationalization: the firm, the individual, the family, and the institutional macro factor. Almost all the studies concentrate on firms, some concentrate on firm and some institutional variable. The other 2 variables, individual and family, are less being investigated. So there is a huge room for investigation and research in this area. The second point I see is topics. There are a number of topics which has been scarcely investigated. Location choices. I think that family firms in ownership and control can impact location choices, but also entry mode. And Xu had discussed about that, so she will I leave to her the discussion on this. The third direction is FDI. IB theory is a theory of FDI, of the border of firms. And surprisingly, the number of studies about family firms and FDI, again, is quite limited. But as far as corporate governance impact on the cost of and on the transaction cost of firms, I think there is room to analyze also this issue. The first direction is exchange with other people from other fields. Family firms allow potentially great cooperation with scholars from many different disciplines, like sociology, political science, law, about inheritance law and property rights and things like that. Let me just mention, if you discuss about the role of family, there are many contributions in sociology, anthropology about the different kind of family. And so potential contribution in this field is surely welcome. I conclude with a methodological remark. A large number of studies are quite weak from the methodological point of view. Family studies often suffer of endogeneity problems, sample bias problems. So here again, we can give a contribution. And I think also coming to the previous point, there is room for a lot of history of business cases. It's important sometimes to study specific cases. But my time is up, so I stop here. I hope I made my main point clear, and I leave the floor to Marleen. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. I think you're right. We're going to quiz you in the Q&A section because there's so many great ideas in your paper for future research, and I'm sure the audience will have questions for you later on. So thank you very much. Our second speaker is going to touch on the idea of theory development and how family business can help us, kind of marry the theories of family business and those of international business. So our second speaker is Luciano Ciravegna, and he joins us from Costa Rica. So thank you very much for joining us. I read on his website that he's interested in family firms in the food and wine industry, which makes me think he's a great co-author to work with. And he wants to know especially how these family firms can achieve extraordinary longevity. Now, Luciano and his colleagues take up a challenge to reflect on IB theories through the family business lens, extending internalization theory while using this concept, Antonio already said it, of firm-specific advantages. And they suggest that families bring a unique flavor to these firm-specific advantages, but the mix of spices in that flavor that the family contributes only works under certain conditions now. And he's going to hopefully explain to us what these conditions are. So how can these unique family flavors benefit family firm internationalization? And to answer this question, I welcome Luciano to our webinar. Luciano, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
All right, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Yeah, so as I was saying, I have been based in London for almost 25 years, and I moved to Costa Rica recently. I still actively collaborate with Henley Business School in Reading, and maybe I'll see some of you at the Reading conference. Yeah, without further ado, let me talk about this. Okay, so what we wanted to do with this paper, which is with also with Liena Cano and Francesco Rattalino from another fellow Italian from ESCP Business School, we kind of wanted to see what are the theoretical links between new internationalization theory and what family business literature can tell us, because we figured out that as Antonio already mentioned in his from his review, there's a lot of stuff around about family firms. It's becoming more and more popular, but at the theoretical level, we think that there's still quite a bit of weakness, meaning that a lot of family firm studies are not too clear about their theoretical grounding. And the studies, the IB studies that look at internationalization of family firms they are quite empirical, meaning that there hasn't been enough debate between the theoretical basis of the two literatures. At least that's what we argue in the paper. So we start from the fact that according to internalization theory, family firms tend to suffer from bifurcation bias, which means that the family gives a preferential treatment to family assets, whether they are buildings or a type of product or family members, right? So you will find families that are in love with a product, and even if it doesn't work, they keep on producing it and they don't want to stop producing it. They might be in love with a location, so it becomes very expensive to have their headquarters in a place and they don't move it. Or simply they are in love with their kids, and even if they are incompetent, they put them in managerial position until the family firm collapses, right? I mean, we all heard these stories, and there's plenty of examples, of real life examples, right? So this bifurcation bias doesn't occur in all family firms, but it's the default system of family firms. Family firms can put specific mechanism to control for it, like hiring external managers, have meritocratic criteria to hire family members, etc. But the point is that even the best, the most successful family firms at some point may suffer from this bifurcation bias. So theoretically, that means the family firms should actually die earlier, should not be able to be competitive for a long period. And statistically, we find evidence of both. A high percentage of family firms don't survive after the second generation. And yet, the longest surviving businesses in the world, they're all family firms. So in the paper, we mentioned, for example, Antinori and Frescobaldi, two winemakers from Italy. Both of them are 700 years old. They've been making wine for 700 years old. And they also make amazing wine, in case you want to try it. You mentioned before, Tignanello is an amazing wine from Antinori. So that leads to the paradox. How do we explain this? On the one hand, we have non-strategic, non-efficiency motives for decisions, such as socio-emotional wealth, what I was mentioning before. You do something because the family wants to do it, not because it's the most efficient choice. On the other hand, you have family firms that survive for the long time, and they also become very international. How do we combine these two views? That's basically the paradox that we try to address. And this is a paper that puts the basis for further research, empirical research, which we just started with that. Okay, so the idea is to integrate this in internalization theory. Our main point here is that the family is a source of specific, unique inputs, resources, which can become firm-specific advantages, but they don't necessarily become firm-specific advantages. So that's the trick. That's where the real issue is. The family firms literature tells us about this. It tells us family firms have a lot of, they are very good at social capital because the family is very much involved. They know all their employees, they know their suppliers personally, so they are very good at developing social capital. They also tell us that family firms have a long-term orientation because they want to transmit wealth, and that they care a lot about reputation. There's a paper by Guido et al. 2017 published in SMJ, where they argue that this kind of reputation explains how firms manage through difficult institutional changes. And they refer to the Tata family business, for example, right? So this is all good, but then the point is all these things would tell us family firms are always the best. However, these resources, if they are not used and combined with firm level resources, they can also lead to failure, such as you develop social capital, you have your contacts, and then you only want to buy from people you know. And therefore, when that becomes inefficient, you keep on buying a component, for example, that is not the best for your business. So emotions and social capital and long-term orientation can lead to the development of SSAs, but under certain conditions. And the conditions is, basically, this is the model we have. And our main point is about recombination. And there are two levels of recombination. The first one, if you see in the middle here, there is a firm boundary. So it's important that you have a recombination here between those three things that I mentioned, social capital, reputation, and long-term orientation, with the internal organizational resources such as, for example, you have administrative managerial knowledge, you bring in external capital, and you combine it with your intentions to have a long-term investment, and then you can do amazing projects. But if it is not recombined, it becomes a family-only issue, it becomes too emotional, and hence it can lead to failure. At the second level, you see here, it needs to be also recombined with resources that allow to deploy these FSAs across national borders. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And this is why it's difficult. Recombination mechanisms are mechanisms that help the company replicate and use these family unique resources. So for example, you have to have mechanisms to reproduce this social capital. And you have to socialize your future family members into how the business works. So an amazing example is the Merck family business. It's a German pharmaceutical that has been around for over 300 years. And they have a family council where they socialize family members from the age of 14, 15 into what the company does. They bring them to the factories, they teach them, they make them do internships. And all of that does not guarantee a job in the company, but it's just to inform them, to let them know, and to make them do menial jobs, humble jobs, so that they don't come one day and want immediately a managerial job, right? And also it gives them knowledge about different operations across the world, not just what they do in the headquarters. So that's an example of a recombination mechanism to do it in the long term. Why is international deployment difficult? And I'm going towards the end of my presentation. It's because a lot of these amazing resources that family has, such as social networks and reputation, they are very location bound, right? So you tend to be very well known in your town, in your region, and if you become successful in your country, and if you become very successful, maybe in the neighboring countries, right? But then you get out of your region and nobody knows who you are. That's the reputation. The contacts as well. You have contacts with your local suppliers, with your local buyers, your distributors. But again, as you get far away from your home, this gets more feeble, right? So it's difficult to internationalize using this kind of FSAs. An example is, the classic European family companies operating in food, right? So companies like Barilla or Ferrero, if you are talking about Italy, but you find similar companies everywhere, and not only in Europe, by the way. So these companies tend to have very good reputations in their communities, to have which help in terms of working together with stakeholders, but they find it a bit hard to replicate it in different locations. So how can you do that? There are mechanisms such as, for example, an example we put in the paper is the Spanish wine producers Torres. They have wineries in different countries, and they have been very active in corporate philanthropy and CSR in Spain. When there was an earthquake in Chile, they deployed the same system of corporate diplomacy to do disaster relief. They arrived before the state arrived, providing relief to all the places where they produce wine. But this is quite a unique example. Usually, the norm is that the family company would do this when it's at home or nearby, but when it is abroad, it's not quite as involved. And that's the limitation, because it means that when family businesses do this, it becomes an FSA in what sense? In a sense that they compete differently from non-family firms. They become more competitive because they have this support from the community, because they are perceived as better employers, for example. But then when they become quite internationalized, especially through FDI, they find it difficult abroad to have the same level of competitiveness. So they compete like any other company in the best case scenario. If they are bifurcation biased, they become less competitive because they don't care quite as much as the abroad location, and they don't apply the same criteria, right? So this is the kind of paradox we are trying to present, and recombination is the key, reminding that in new internalization theory, the recombination part is key. And I'm going to conclude here. I didn't quite check the time. I think more or less it's fine. So the contribution is to infuse socioeconomic wealth, which is the idea from family firms, with the theoretical rigor of new internalization theory, which is based on TCE, and also to bring some novelty to new internationalization theory, because let's remember that new internalization theory explicitly says that does not predict decisions that are not based on efficiency. So new internationalization theory, according to the people who actually wrote the theory, is not applicable to companies that are led in an emotional way. So what we are trying to do here is we're trying to say we can just make an extension to new internationalization theory, and it does still apply as far as we take these conditions. Future research, there's a lot to do. I think Antonio gave a very nice and thorough presentation of that. I think that, for example, we don't know much about what happens, after market entries of family firms or non-family firms, and of family firms managed in different ways. So that's something that we need to know more about. And this is about writing cases. It's about qualitative research informing us, because we don't know much about these processes yet. And the second part is the transformation. So we've observed family firms that through the years, they transform and they become less and less like family firms and more like multinational firms, which are owned by families, right? This transformation process, I think, is extremely interesting, because we move from a company in which emotions and social drivers determine strategy to companies which are very much akin a multinational enterprise owned by shareholders, right? How that happens and what are the implications of the stage of this transformation in which you are in for internationalization, I think that's the most interesting bit of research to explore for me. Meaning, for example, are you a Chinese family business in its first generation about to pass the baton to the second? Are you an Italian family business which is 700 years old? Are you a German family business that is 150 years old? Does it matter for the way in which you are operating across borders? Maybe it doesn't, but it will be interesting to know more about this evolution. So it is about kind of tracing back the history and trying to find out more about these processes. For example, the first investments abroad made in the past by old family businesses, and comparing to what's going on in more recent times. Anyway, I'm going to close here because I could be talking for a long time and I have a lot of examples in my head, but let's stop here. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luciano. And I can see some questions already coming in, so that's very good.
Marleen, are we supposed to answer the question after all the presentation, correct?
Yeah, how all the presentations first, and then I will pick the questions.
Okay,
so
thank you.
To give a transition between Luciano and our next speaker, allow me, at the great risk of oversimplifying, to briefly outline this concept of socio-emotional wealth, because I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with it. So let me give you a very simplified idea of that. So businesses are supposed to pursue commercial goals, but family businesses, in addition to commercial goals, also pursue other types of goals, which are summarized by this concept of socio-emotional wealth. Now, in family business literature, socio-emotional wealth also consists of different things. And these components are not always in sync. There can also be inconsistencies within that concept. So it's actually a somewhat confusing, but also very interesting construct to be working with. It's good that Luciano started to talk about this, and Kai is also going to pick this up. So our third paper is going to be presented by Kai Su, who is joining us from the University of Texas at San Antonio. And Kai's work has focused on institutional factors influencing firm internationalization. And they're going to, her paper delves into the more granular issue of entry mode decisions. I already saw a question in the audience, from the audience on this. And how does ownership matter for these decisions? And what also is very exciting about this paper is that it looks at different types of family firms with different levels or types of socio-emotional wealth, right? So we're really getting into the issue of the family firm heterogeneity. And I think that's also a very important topic. So this third paper is really crucial to our webinar today. And Kai, we cannot wait to have your story here as well. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marleen. Thank you for the summary. That's a very good summary for our research. So in this research, we also talk about the family firm and the unique characteristics of, in terms of their entry mode. So I see some questions in the Q&A box, and they ask why we need a new theory to explain family business internationalization. Here, we speak to the entry mode research in our study. So the older traditional entry mode research, we know it's a major strain in international business, but most of the entry mode choice research, they use either ownership location internalization framework or resource-based view, knowledge-based view, or institutional theory. But what is missing in those research is that where is the decision maker? How can we make sure they make the decision based on the resources, based on the opportunity exploration and exploitation? So is it possible there is a personal bias? So in this study, we introduced this individual difference or individual preference. So you may wonder why that matters. If we just want to maximize our profit, why we have this individual preference? So here I use a quotation from our interview to prove individual preference matters. So during the study, we interviewed quite a few CEOs. And this quotation is very interesting. It is from a CEO of a Chinese listed company. And the CEO basically saying that, of course, I want a partner. I want a joint venture, because if this partner doesn't want to go with me into an environment I know nothing about, it is a pretty good indicator that I shouldn't go. So as you can see from this quotation, there's nothing about the resources, nothing about the asset specificity. It's all about the personal preferences. So I think, wow, that's a very interesting quotation. It really puts a decision maker into this research, into the entry mode decision. And as we have discussed this morning in the past 40 minutes, why family business is so unique, because family owners have this social emotional wealth pursuit. So they try to protect their family control, and also they are very loss averse or risk averse. So in this study, we focus on family firms, and we try to see how family business will make an entry mode decision. Also, what if family owners are the dominant owners, or in other cases that the family owners, they are not the dominant owners, are they going to fight for this social emotional wealth? So that's our research questions. So we made 3 contributions. The first one, of course, we bring in the family values into the entry mode research. And the second one is that, as we can see from this quotation, they immediately eliminate the wholly owned subsidiary. They said, I don't want to do wholly owned subsidiary. So here we argue that when we look at family business entry mode decision, maybe they only look at the truncation of the entry mode. They don't look at the full spectrum of the entry mode. So that's our second contribution. And the third one is that we rely on the contingency theory, and we argue things might be different if the family owners are the dominant owners, or they just minority, but still influential owners. So that's our 3 theoretical contribution. Then the interesting thing is that because we look at the truncation of the entry mode, we introduced this new theory called the sequential decision-making theory. So this sequential decision-making theory wasn't a new theory. It was developed by Tversky in 1972. So he proposed that when we make decisions, we don't make so-called rational decision making. Actually, we have two stages. The first one will be elimination stage. The second one will be selection stage. In the elimination stage, we eliminate all the things we don't like. Then we pick something from all the acceptable options. So he used Tversky, used a car purchasing as an example. If you remember when you first trying to buy a car, and then there is some elimination stage, elimination criteria, no matter it is price or oil efficiency, or even for a lot of girls, it can be even color, right? So you immediately eliminate some options, and then you pick one from the remaining acceptable options. So that's how we make a decision. And we were wondering, is it possible we can apply this sequential decision making to entry mode choice? Because the family owners, they are different. You can see they immediately eliminate wholly owned subsidiary in the first stage of their decision making. Then they will choose the entry mode from all the acceptable, like a majority joint venture or minority joint venture. That's their second stage decision-making process. So family values, I don't have to repeat what is social emotional wealth. Everybody has said that. I'm sure you have heard social emotional wealth 3 times so far. But in this study, we focus on 2 dimensions of social emotional wealth. The first one is financial constraints, because family firms try to maintain their financial control or family control. And so sometimes they can be financial constrained. And the second one is their loss aversion, or sometimes we call that risk aversion. But later on, Luis Gomez-Mejia argued that it's not risk aversion, it's just loss aversion. They are so afraid they will lose family control. So based on all the theories I introduced so far, here comes our hypothesis. The first one will be the first stage of entry-mode decision. We argue that if family owners are the dominant owners, then they tend to choose a joint venture because they are financial constrained and also they are loss averse. But also in the first stage, what if family owners are not the dominant owners? They are minority, but still influential owners. What if institutional investors are actually the dominant owners? We know institutional investors, they are very financial driven. They only want to maximize their profits. So here we argue that if institutional investors are the dominant owners, there is 2 reasons that they will pursue wholly owned subsidiaries. The first one is that they have a huge, relatively spread out investment portfolio, so they can spread their risks among all different foreign subsidiaries. And the second reason is very interesting because based on the accounting rules, we know there's many accounting rules all over the world. In US, we use GAAP, and in the rest of the world, most of the countries use IFRS. For IFRS, they have very strict accounting rules. They said that you can only fully consolidate the profit from your foreign subsidiaries if you 100% have 100% control of that foreign subsidiaries. So if I think about this accounting rules, then we know institutional investors, in order to make their financial report look very good, they are highly motivated to have 100% control, because that's only when you consolidate all the profit from the foreign subsidiaries. So based on those 2 reasons, we argue that institutional investors actually are more likely to choose wholly owned subsidiaries compared to the family owners. And what about the second stage? In the second stage, we look at different ownership structures. If family owners is the minority, but influential investors, we argue that they will fight very hard because they are under diversified. The huge chunk of their family wealth is invested in that company. So they will fight to have an acquisition instead of a wholly owned subsidiary. If you remember, in the second hypothesis, we argue institutional investors are more likely to choose wholly owned subsidiaries. But under that category, we have a greenfield investment and acquisition. Here we argue if family owners, they are smaller, but they would like to see acquisition instead of a greenfield investment, because acquisition, like Luciano argued, that they only have a local network. But if they have acquisition in a foreign country instead of greenfield investment, the acquisition can help them to build their social capital in that foreign country. So here we argue, but also institutional investors, they are more likely to make a compromise, because both the greenfield investment and acquisition are acceptable options for them. So they are more likely to make a compromise. So they will choose, in the second stage, they are more likely to choose acquisition instead of greenfield investment. But also in the second stage, we also argue that we don't expect that this compromise will be seen in the family dominant firms, because first, the family owners, they wouldn't like the institutional investors to develop into relatively influential owners in that company. So you may see a small percentage of institutional ownership in family firms, but you wouldn't see a large institutional ownership in family firms. So based on this, we argue that we don't expect we'll see family firm to compromise in the second stage. And for the method, we have a relatively large sample from all over the world and in a relatively long time period. But for the analysis, it's quite unique because we use a nested logic model to test the hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2. Nested logic model allows us to see if family owners prefer joint venture in the first stage, and if institutional or investors prefer wholly owned in the first stage. But unfortunately, nested logic model cannot model the second stage decision. So to model the second stage decision, we use a Heckman selection model. And all the hypotheses was supported. And we did quite a few postdoc tests to make sure that our results are not biased because of the cutoff we use, or the sample we use, or some control variables we didn't consider in the model. So all the postdoc tests support our results. And of course, our studies have a few limitations and future directions. First, we think all the international business research shows that sometimes companies will choose locations and entry mode at the same time. So maybe family firms, if they go to this country, they will use certain types of entry mode, but if they go to another country, they prefer another type of entry mode. So that's one future directions. And the second one is that the board experience matters. We see some research shows that if family firms, they have the board of directors who already have international experience, then they can be less risk averse. So, and also institutional investors, different institutional investors may have different risk preferences. So that's our research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Kai, for presenting your paper. That was a really interesting paper, and it goes, I think we are going to go into the Q&A right away. And Klaus, at any time you want to jump in, feel free to do so. I've already seen many questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to pick the one that got several likes and that I also find very important. And I'm going to throw it to Antonio in a second. So Carol Cooper says, could you please expand slightly on family firms' heterogeneity and the sources of that heterogeneity in the context of internationalization? Now, it's kind of incredible that your neighborhood restaurant and Tata, which has 12 listed companies or more, are all family firms, and we cannot expect them to behave in the same way, obviously. So what are the sources of that heterogeneity? Antonio?
Well, thank you very much for the question. There are a lot of different sources of heterogeneity, and I can name few of them because I explore them. In my paper with Jean-François and Nag, we explore, for example, the role of strategy and business model more precisely. So we saw that there are sources of heterogeneity in selecting the strategy. But the sources of heterogeneity are almost, uncountables in the sense that there are sources of heterogeneity, I don't know, in the combination of ownership, family with different kind of shareholder, in other combination in the social capital, that is relationship, probably in the goal that the family has, because maybe also in exploring this question, I answer also to what's different between family firms is that family firms, not the maximization of utility function for a family shareholder is different from the maximization of utility function of a corporate, of a financial investor. So what is the best choice for a family shareholder maybe is not the best choice for most of the other company with financial investors that just look for a financial return. So the sources of heterogeneity are really a lot in the family, in the institution, in the firm itself. And I mean, I think it's a huge question. So really, the real answer is I don't know, because it's the sources of heterogeneity which impact internationalization are the one who are worth to explore. Strategy, composition, also the composition of the management team, for example. There are some companies which are open to external managers, some other not. The training of the family member, whatever, as Luciano mentioned before, in the Merck case, whatever. So it's really an unfair question because I don't know I don't know the answer. It's too broad, but it's a very good question, and it's at the heart of the research. If you find a source of heterogeneity which impact your dependent variable, it's worth to investigate. I'm fully aware that I do not answer fully the question.
Okay, yeah, I think I will give Luciano the floor in a second. I think you're right that there are many sources, but what has been measured in the literature is still quite limited in terms of, what Kai has done as well, and the level of ownership, or the level and magnitude of how many family leaders are in the management team, etc. So we could be looking at so many more variables there. Okay, let me throw the floor to Luciano. You're on mute, so go ahead, Luciano.
Yeah, no, very quickly, a very easy answer to the question is that there's a lot of different types of families. So even that provides quite a lot of heterogeneity, right? And the second is that what both me and Antonio mentioned before, which is the time. What time are we in the family history? And that matters a lot for the way in which the family behaves, and hence how the firm behaves. That in itself gives a lot of heterogeneity. And then there is the classic heterogeneity that we find in firms, right? I mean, size, business, and all of that.
Yes, okay, good addition. Kai, you looked at one type of heterogeneity, right? Ownership level.
Yes.
You want to add anything on to this?
Oh, yeah. I think the institutional environment can be a very big factor that can influence the firm heterogeneity. I remember I interviewed family owners in China, and because if you remember the SEW, social emotional wealth, they predict family firms are very long-term oriented because they want to pass their family business to their future generations. So they are theoretically, they are very long-term oriented. But in China, because this institutional environment, during the interview, the family owners mentioned that I never think about the second generation. Maybe our business will be gone tomorrow, and I cannot plan in long term. So that's a very interesting heterogeneity because of the institutional environment. And also I work with my doctoral student on a project. She also had this very interesting observation. We know Luis Gomez Mejia found that family firms in Europe, they are they have this community logic. So they follow the community logic, they are more likely to protect the environment. But in Taiwan, because in Taiwan in general, Taiwan is very resource constrained, and they pay a lot of attention to environmental protection. But the interesting is family owners in Taiwan, actually, they try to transfer those highly polluted industry. So the family owners in those industries, they try to transfer their operations to China. So you cannot say they just transfer their pollution. They are not very environmental conscientious. They just want to transfer their pollution to another country. So that's another, we call that corporate social irresponsibility, right? So I see a lot of family firm heterogeneity. It all depends on what kind of environment you are in. The social emotional wealth that can apply to family firms in different countries in different ways.
Okay, thank you, Kai. I see questions coming in also, like, speaking to what you're talking about. So maybe I'll quickly pick them up so that we keep the same topic. So Stuart Miller says that I was intrigued by the notion of long-term orientation in Luciano's presentation. At what point in the evolution does it become an issue for the family? Founder, second, third generation, and how do you expect to see long-term orientation in family firms vary across countries, which is what Kai just spoke about. Luciano, long-term orientation, when does it start to be a thing in family firms?
Well, I'm going to answer without answering the question because we don't know the answer yet. In short, and I think it's intellectually honest to admit when we don't know something, not because I don't know it, but because the literature doesn't know it. And in fact, I've seen very few papers using the concept of long-term orientation published with an IB angle, looking at internationalization. If you have more, please share them with me because we couldn't find much. And I think it's precisely an interesting area. We think that it becomes really interesting after you pass the third generation point. And I personally think, and here I'm biased, but I think one of the weaknesses of family firm research is that a lot of papers that allegedly look at family firms, they actually use data which qualify as a family firm, a firm where the founder is still leading the company. By that definition, Facebook, or Meta as it's called now, is a family firm. Now, I don't find that convincing because the real difficulty of family firms, and when they really become something different from a founder and led entrepreneurial firm, which is something that the entrepreneurship literature tells us a lot about. So if you want to know how a founder-led company is led, we can look at entrepreneurship journals, and there's a lot of interesting information there, including in IB. Family firms become different when there is the family in between, it means it's not just Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, but then they start deciding they have kids, and then their kids have kids, and then it becomes, there's an issue of who's going to be who's going to manage the company, what are we going to do, how professionalized this is going to be. And this means that quite a lot of empirical studies don't look at this kind of stuff. So my answer is we need to look at family firms through time, because that's when long-term orientation distinguishes them from non-family firms. After you pass the third generation, there's really an issue like, should we just sell and make money and go live in an island? Or should we continue with this? And who is going to continue? And the long-term orientation, is it long-term about wealth, or is it about the business? And this is also a difference I found in the qualitative fieldwork we did Some family businesses are very much about the firm. So they are a family firm, and the firm comes before the family, and there's a lot of identification between the two, meaning that they don't want to let go. Even when the business goes bad, they stick to the business because it's part of their identity. And that's social emotional wealth for you, because the rational decision sometimes is to let go. Some other family businesses, like these 700-year-old companies which were started during the Renaissance, they are very much about wealth. What they care is not dissipating wealth. They care about their inheritance being passed through time. And they were very explicit about, look, we've been in a lot of businesses. We continue to do wine, but meanwhile, we've been bankers. We lost all, we made it back. We've been in textiles, in trading, insurance. The point is to make sure that the heirs will get some of that wealth. And that's a very different attitude to be a firm. Like, for example, the Japanese Onsei springs. There are some companies managing these springs, which are also over 600 years old, but for them, it's the business. It's not the wealth, it's they want to keep doing the same thing, even though it might become less and less profitable through time. So I think the long-term orientation needs to be disentangled with bifurcation bias. Is it a long-term orientation to reproduce wealth, to be efficient, and so you invest in a project that might have a very long time span to develop, but it is an efficiency-based thing? Or is it long-term orientation because you really want your family in the future to be doing the same thing because you have a strong emotional attachment to that? I think that's the real question.
Yeah, very good answer. I might add that in the family business literature, they also play with different concepts. So I'm, for instance, editing a book on business families. So because some people feel that family business is too much about one family in one business, whereas there are families that don't even have a business, or they may have had one in the past, or they may have 20 businesses. So the reality for those is very different. So there are different types and different long-term orientation attitudes as well. Okay, good. Thank you very much. I have so many questions which I'm not all going to be able to answer, but I'll pick up one from Sumit. And this goes to Antonio, because Sumit says there's no mention on the headquarters subsidiary relationship in the family firm, and that's a big theme in international business. So, in your literature review, what did you find on this, Antonio?
Yes, Sumit is right. Sumit is a co-author, so I think it's so he picked up one of the theme I didn't have time to develop. My fault, Sumit, you got it right. Internal organization in family firms is surely one of the additional topic that can be explored, because the idea that you have internal social capital, as Luciano said, you family managers tend to behave in the company, tend to behave like in the family sometimes. So the organizational structure of family firms could be different. We didn't find a lot of paper on this. So again, this is something that should be potentially investigated. I don't know if family ownership really impact on organization. This is a question that is worth to be investigated. So I don't know really the answer to the question, but it's potentially very important. A lot of there is a limited number of people look at the internal organization of family firms.
Yeah. Okay, so that's another promising area. I'm just going to pick up one more question. Luciano gave me a message earlier that he wanted to answer this question, and it's a question by Yoon. It's about hi Yoon, good to see her again. It's about social capital, and she says that non-family firms also try to formulate social capital and do stakeholder engagement in their internationalization. So, how do family firms differ from non-family firms in that area?
Thank you for that question. I think also Keith Brouters made a comment about that, meaning that, yes, I agree, non-family firms also use social capital. It's a very well-documented thing, especially founded, where the founder, entrepreneur or entrepreneurs are still in a leading position in the firm. But there are some really, really big differences. If we go back to the theory of social capital, so people like Coleman, Nunn, Lee, Powell, sociologists who developed the Granovetter, who developed the idea of social capital and social ties and social networks, how do you form and maintain social capital? Through social interactions, right? The main repository of social capital, according to sociology, is the family. The family is where social capital starts, okay? How do you maintain it through time? Through continuity, continuous personalized relationships. So there's a big difference between family firms and non-family firms. Actually, there are several differences. The first one is that in terms of time and continuity, family firms have lower turnover amongst their employees, and especially at the managerial level. I mean, many family firms have the same CEO for 50 years, right? And there is statistics proving this. I'm not just saying it. So what does it mean? If the top management team remains the same, their relationship, their social capital continues to accumulate and build up through time. The level of turnover in a non-family company is so much higher. The CEO changes, the top management changes, and therefore they bring their own social capital to the other company where they move. Simple as that. So there is more continuity, which means that the social capital of family firms reproduces, builds up, and becomes bigger through time with less turnover. So you could argue that it's not necessarily a positive thing. It means family firms have more social capital, but it's also more of the same. Non-family firms have a more diversified social capital because they have more turnover. They bring in people from outside, so they can be more creative, perhaps more dynamic, unless family firms also bring people from outside. And that's our point about recombination. But in terms of quantity, family firms tend to have more because of that, because of the accumulation through time, the lower turnover, and also another critical point. The social capital of a non-family firm is the sum of the individual social capital of the management team. The social capital of a family firm is the social capital of the family, which is translated into the company, and it sums up to the individual social capital of non-family managers. So you have family people, family members who are not working in the company, and yet their social capital contributes to the organizational level social capital. And that's why they have more and they use more. In what way? Well, think about, for example, a son who doesn't work in the company, in the family business. He's doing an MBA or found a job in the US, and this is a German family business. Then he's working in the US and meets somebody that is a potential client. He will use his social capital to help the family business, even though he's not a manager in the family business. This doesn't happen outside of family firms. If this person is an outsider, doesn't know much, has no links with a company, okay, as a friend, it might happen, but not quite as much as with family. So family uses the individual reputation and contacts of the whole family, it can use at least, to support the social networks, contacts, and reputation of the organization. If they manage to recombine this, it's a very powerful mechanism. And I think it's very different in non-family firms. So that's, I think, together with the preference for personalized management style, which Antonio mentioned as well, then it means that really we have a different way of competing. Now, do all family firms do it? No, some family firms compete like all others, and some firms do it too much in a non-efficient way because they're bifurcation biased. So there is heterogeneity, but I think there is a big difference with non-family firms.
Can I add just a word? Let's spend 10 seconds. Let me underline that this impact on internationalization. Family firm will develop this kind of social capital, as Luciano mentioned. We found that tend to be more effective in export market. I'm talking about export market when they specialize in a niche, high quality kind of market. So this is a typical example of a family FSA which impact on overall internationalization. So there is a relationship with these aspects and internationalization. I want to mention this because it's at the heart of today's discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. I have still seen many questions, and I apologize to those people who we have not been able to, whose questions we have not been able to address. I think AIB is a community of colleagues and friends, so I encourage all of you to write to the authors to ask your questions. Several PhD students as well ask questions on topics for their dissertation, and this is really important, and we want to support you as well. Now, having said that, we are running over time, and I am going to hand over to Klaus for a few magic words to close the webinar. Klaus.
Hey, thank you very much, Marleen. Thank you very much, all the speakers. I see Antonio is posting his email in the chat, so I think that's an encouragement. If you have specific questions you want to follow up, feel free to contact the authors. Just an important point, all these papers have been published in JIBS and are available on the JIBS website or through your library, hopefully. And if not, tell your librarian to subscribe or become a member of the AIB, which I'm sure Tunga, who is sitting in the back, will appreciate me making that advertisement. Another advantage of being AIB member is you will be able to see this webinar again on the AIB website. We also post the webinars on YouTube, although there's usually a little bit of a delay. Although if you have PhD students, do direct them to that website on YouTube. That's a very useful resource because we have today the 22nd webinar already on the 22nd of February of the 22nd year of this millennium. Nice timing, Marleen. Thank you for getting that right. I do have one big picture thought at this stage. You, in the family firm literature, you talk a lot about what other people would call microfoundations. That is the link between the characteristics of the decision makers and the owners and strategy variables. The theory of the multinational enterprise and other related theories tend to theorize on the level of the firm. And there is a considerable discourse now trying to bring in so-called micro-foundations, bringing in the characteristics of the decision maker, the process by which decisions are made, and connecting that with the theory, which is essentially at the level of the firm. There are different traditions that exist longer, including the Uppsala model or the behavioral theory of the firm, but it's a lot of interest in this. And I think there is a connection between the work that people are doing in this community on the family firm and the interest in, let's call it mainstream, or maybe I should say other IB researchers who are interested in these micro foundations and the bringing in the manager into the study of the strategies of the multinational enterprise. With that concluding thought, I would like to invite you to join the next webinar, which will also be a sort of micro foundations webinar. We will talk about expatriates and their link to the knowledge management. That webinar will be scheduled sometime in the second half of March, and watch your usual places for the invitations and then sign up. For today, thank you very much, everyone. Also for the audience to be persistent despite us having a late start. Thank you for your questions, and goodbye.